Good afternoon. Um, Today is a very, very special episode. Um, I have a guest with me who has probably been through every up and every down, every high, every low. Um, and we're very privileged to have him here today on MindLift. Um, I'm going to introduce to you Mr. Jay Scher. And rather than telling you about him myself, I'm going to get him to actually talk through his story, which is full, it's filled with inspiration, it's filled with challenges, it's filled with adversity and obstacles. And in his own words, he's going to explain all of the journey that he's taken to get to the point that he is at at the moment. Um, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Jay Scher. Hi, Jay.
Hey, how are you, man?
Very good. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for giving up your time. I know you're a very, very busy schedule. So we really appreciate you giving us.
It's my pleasure.
Now, you've been around here for how long in Dubai now?
This is my 5th day in Dubai. Yeah.
Amazing. And we've hosted an evening with you,
Yes.
which unfortunately I couldn't make. Now, normally when we have guests or we have topics, Tanvi, our marketing lead over there, gives us a briefing, gives us an overview. And actually, I just got 2 sentences, and purposefully, I've not done much more. And there's a reason behind this. It's not out of disrespect. It's not out of ill preparation. It's actually what I want to do is I want to share the same feelings, the same emotions, and those same questions that I think a lot of our listeners are going to have about your journey, about your current situation, where you're at, and what you've done to get there. So without further ado, I am going to give you the floor is yours. Tell us a bit about yourself from the very start.
Well, thanks again for having me. It's really an honor to sit here and talk with you and to be able to share parts of my life and story. And, I'll just touch on that moment of gratitude for a second before I get into the history. I came into visiting Dubai for business reasons, and a very dear friend of mine is associated with the DP World Brain and Performance Center, and asked me to talk with some people here, and I said yes, and against my better judgment at the time, because I've said no to everything. People have asked me many times, tell your story, but I'm very sensitive about how I spend my time, because I'm very aware of how little time we have here on Earth. And so I'm very cognizant of the minutes and seconds of every day. And so I've always said no to sharing this. When I said yes to this, it was one of those moments where it's the right thing to do, but you're not sure where it's going to lead. And it's been such a fulfilling journey to do this, to talk with such a caring and empathetic group of people about what I've been through, and to hear the responses has been really fulfilling for me on many levels, and healing and cathartic, and that's beyond any expectation. So thank you. And so thank you for this moment to spend time with you and to share with you, a little bit about my story. The story starts actually in 1993. I was in a car accident when I was 19 years old. And in that car accident, I lost my spleen. I lost a very dear friend. And I also lost my spleen in that accident. I had all sorts of internal bleeding, and ended up recovering from that. And at the time, this was, obviously early 90s, it wasn't quite understood the role that the spleen played in the body. It was almost, some would have argued it was like an appendix. And if you lose it, you're okay. You'll figure your life out. But about 10 years into that journey, people started talking about the importance of the spleen and the immune system. So that's a little pocket of information. We'll just tuck that aside for now. We'll come back to that later. So fast forward now to 2019. So many, many years later. And at this point in my life, I am in business for myself. I'm doing angel investing in startups uh, uh, with usually artistic entrepreneurs that are in the States, we call it CPG, consumer products goods, restaurants, things of that nature. Um, and athletically, I'm in the peak, athleticism of my life. I was in doing long distance endurance motorcycle racing in the desert in Mexico, multiple day hiking trips in Norway, climbing mountains and snowboarding down and running Ironman triathlons. And so I was feeling great. I was 45 years old, had two young children, 6 and 9 years old, and everything was kind of just clicking along. And it was February 18th. I remember just kind of feeling a little bit sluggish and down, and like, oh, wow, I'm coming down with something. And that was on like a Monday or Tuesday, and I was down in Miami. By that Friday, I was back in Chicago. I flew back home. My partner Robert and I were opening up our restaurant, our pizza restaurant, which is become world famous, and it's really been exciting to be a part of. But I was getting very sick, and I was actually dying, and I didn't realize it. And I just felt like I had a really bad cold, the flu. And I had missed a meeting that day with Robert, and he called me and said, what are your symptoms? What's going on? And I said, man, I am just so tired. My legs feel heavy, everything. It feels like I have like water in my body. I'm just exhausted. I'm passing out everywhere. And the weirdest thing is I can't really see anymore. My vision is fading. He said, what do you mean you can't see? I said, well, I can't read my phone anymore. Everything's just blurry. And he said, okay, I'm going to bring you in, get you checked out. I was, I'm okay. I just need some chicken soup. And, as a lot of guys do, I'm tough. I'm going to sleep it off. I'm going to sweat it out. I'm going to wake up. I'm going to feel better. It's just a flu. He happened to have had a bout of meningitis about 15 years earlier. And the last thing he remembers in the emergency room was he lost his vision. And he said, look, if your vision's going, I don't think you're doing well. So he came by the house and he brought me to the emergency room. And the last memory I have that day was we were driving to the hospital. And if you've ever had tunnel vision, if you've ever been in a car accident or something like that, and you get that tunnel vision where everything's hazy around whatever object is, that's what I was seeing all the time. And I said, I'm glad you're driving because I can't see very well right now. And that's the last memory I had. What I was told was I went to the hospital, checked myself in, signed myself in. And I later heard from the emergency room doctor who I reached out to and said, can you tell me the story? And he said, I took one look at you and he's like, I just knew you were not well. And so we brought you back right away. My blood pressure at the time was like 80 over 30 or something like that. I mean, it was just, I shouldn't have been standing, and heart rate was at, 120 or something, tachycardia all over the place. At this point I'm out. So that was my last memory. Robert's there and the doctor comes out and he said it was a younger doctor, kind of had, a little bit teary eyed and said, are you family? He said, no, I'm his business partner. What do you need his family for? Is everything okay? He said, no, he's probably going to die in the next few hours. He's really, really sick. He said, what are you talking about? We just walked in. They said, yeah, we don't understand it either, but yeah. And so that began my journey. And so then the folks at Northwestern in Chicago, which I just, thank God that I was there and had this level of emergent care, which, if I would have went to the local hospital next to my house or something like that, I don't think I'm sitting here talking to you. They're just not equipped to deal with, this type of patient. So very soon after that, I was put on 1 vasopressor, 2 vasopressors, eventually 6 vasopressors, dialysis around the clock, the blood cleaning machines around the clock, whatever life support the hospital has, I was on. Um, and at some point, a week or so into it, it was basically, I went back and read all these text threads in the friend group, and my friends were, texting each other, and it was always, you got to get here now. Jay's going to die. And I was like, oh, Jay didn't die, and this was going on for days and weeks. And eventually the hospital, said, look, we've never given anyone 6 vasopressors before. First of all, that's, we're outside of the bounds of medicine. We're basically microwaving this guy. We've got to unplug him. We're done. And so, thank God, my wife and my brother, were very, they really believed that I was going to pull through beyond any measure of a doubt, beyond anything that, I don't fault the doctors for saying unplug the guy. I mean, we all have a job to do. You play the numbers. It's, they were 100% right in their assessment of the situation. And even now when I meet my doctors in the hall, and some of them become some of my closest friends in life, they say, like, I can't believe that you're alive. It'd be one thing if you lived and you were a vegetable. I could maybe put those pieces together. But the fact that you're sitting here and talking to me, and that your brain works when, you're officially brain dead, that's when they say, time to pull the plug. All the neurologists and everybody, the brain scans, there was, no activity. The counter argument to that later, now that I tell the doctors, is I was aware of everything. I heard the conversations in the room. I knew who was there. I had the experiences. I had the floating over your body experience. I could describe people's facial expressions. I could describe what they were wearing. And so, yes, my body was probably at the very limits of what we technically can support life. But, although my brain was technically not alive from a brain scan, there's limits to what brain scans can sense and sing. And obviously, I'm, living proof of that. And so when you read a lot about people who have had NDEs or near-death experiences, that is a kind of a common theme in there. So, at some point, I do start to recover. And,
Just to interject on that.
yeah,
Last memory before this episode was you actively remember coming out of the car, going into the hospital.
I remember the car ride. Don't remember getting out.
Thank God you're driving.
Yeah, saying that to Robert. Yeah.
Senator rope and going towards the hospital.
Yeah.
What was the first memory or the first recollection you had where you said you were aware, faces, voices, things being said?
Yeah.
Or what could you pinpoint as being the first time that you remember waking up?
When I first woke up, I remember I knew I was sick, and I knew I wasn't well, but I had no comprehension of how sick or how unwell I was. Um, I knew I had trouble seeing. I had this idea, and this is where, like, I thank God I have this, like, I just had this idea that I was going to get better. I never for a moment thought that I was going to die or that I was going to get worse. I just was like, okay, well, the same type of thought process that almost killed me, just a month before, sitting at home as my blood pressure drops dangerously low and my heart rate's through the roof. And I'm a triathlete who's wearing a Garmin watch who could easily check his vitals. But, I just need that same level of kind of optimism and positive speak that I just have. It was just, I never thought, my first thought when I woke up was, okay, something's happened. I'll just get better and I'll be out of here soon enough.
It's just this unrelenting kind of belief that it's fine, I'll overcome this.
Yeah.
Already thinking about the future.
Yeah. Already thinking about the future that and so then.
So at what point did the gravity of the situation really hit you? What was that point where you realized, actually, this is not just something, with all due respect, that is going to be something I'm going to get over quickly. I'll be out of here tomorrow. I'll be out of there next week. I won't win with any draw.
Honestly, that I didn't hit that point until almost 9 months later, when I was home alone and my cheering squad that showed up every day for me in the hospital. And, you know, it didn't really hit me until everybody went home and it was quiet and it was just me in my handicapped accessible apartment, sitting in bed, waiting for someone to come over and help me, but not wanting to call my aide because I'm just like, I'm not asking for help and this and that. When you're in the hospital, it's a very surreal place. It's a place of healing. So especially when you're in the ICU, you know, there's constant attention. There's constant, focus. You have visitors all day long. I mean, I had a lot of visitors, a lot of people come see me. So it was a very unrealistic kind of environment. And the actual gravity of it from an emotional standpoint didn't hit me until I went home. From a physical standpoint, I still had this idea. I was like, oh, okay, we're going to cut my limbs off. I'll get some prosthetics. All right, cool. People show me pictures of, bionic hands and legs and okay, great. Yeah, I'll figure that out. I could do this. There's actually a really funny conversation where I'm talking to one of my doctors who is a close friend of mine now, a guy named Greg Dumanian. And he's a world famous plastic surgeon and neurosurgeon. And he's explaining to me what we're doing with the amputations. And I'm telling him that I appreciate what he's saying, but I really just need to focus on, getting the tissue in the right places because I've got an Ironman race that I have to compete in 9 months. And I have a recording of this conversation. He's very patient with me and he's, okay, well, we're doing this one thing at a time. And, now we laugh about it because when I was complaining to him just a month ago, oh, Greg, my skin's breaking down my legs and it's not. And he's just like, Jay, he's like, these amputations, we covered you with skin grafts. Like this was merely to close open wounds and try to stop infection. There was no version of this where we were amputating your limbs for prosthetics. This was completely done to save your life. And the fact that you're walking around and doing what you're doing today is nothing short of a miracle. And so it's those reminders but the tie-in to what we were talking about before is just, I've come to realize that I have a very strong, unrelenting sense of optimism, positivity, and just belief that everything around me is like a puzzle and I just need to try to solve it. And if I keep putting one foot in front of the other and I keep working on it, eventually I will. And I don't want to take credit for that in like some kind of self-help way or anything like that. I would never direct that to anyone else. I would just say that I am acutely aware of the fact that either that's in my DNA or in my spirit or a gift from above or however you want to describe it.
That'd be interesting point about this. And I think that I'm just trying to figure out the best way in which to articulate this it is that very same belief or that same unrelenting attitude that's probably gotten you to the point where you've got to in life. The counter argument is that's also it's that unrelenting belief that potentially, without sounding kind of judgmental, potentially got you also into the situation that you get yourself into.
Yeah.
Sometimes identification of an issue of a problem and knowing when to help. And a lot of women will say this is a very much a XY comes as in us as male.
Yeah.
But I think it goes beyond that. I think it's also what makes us successful and what drives us can also at times hinder us.
Yeah.
And it's controversial and when we say it, but the reality is there's some truth in it. So we were talking just about, I'll do it a little bit and cut in. So we're talking about self-belief and pride and the self-belief and drive you had, that you had at that moment, got you through, got you to the position that you're at now. But the flip side, or the other side of the coin is if it wasn't for what some people value as self and pride, you equally would have maybe sought help sooner. Or I'm actually identifying or which I need to seek help for.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I think we as humans are programmed to be optimistic, right? No one sits at home with a flu or a cold and says, I'm going to die. And when people say, what's it like? I always tell them, well, dying's actually, it's not that bad. It's, and, it just, it's like going to sleep. Um, so, I think we all have that at some level because otherwise every emergency room in every country would just be full of people who they have a headache and, they're worried about, having a situation of mortality. So, I just, I just think I probably have that a little bit more than the average person. And, that's why I probably pursued the hobbies that I did, which a lot of people say, why you would ride your motorcycle? That's crazy. Why would you do that? You're swimming how far? Why would you do that? You're, aren't you worried about getting buried in an avalanche? Like, why would you do that? And it's like, so there is this fine line. I think that's a really good point that you touch on, which is like, you know, you, the area of space that you live in that gives you the ultimate feeling of life and exhilaration of life and has the most meaning and significance is a very small window, and you just squeak through it. And if you ride that line, it's awesome. But a little bit more to one side and you're not getting out of bed in the morning, and a little bit more to the other side and you're probably taking too much risk and you're not going to be around that long. So, I would say that I'm probably a bit more risk adverse now than I was, but at the same time, um, I I also continue to try and push myself outside of my comfort zone. And as I talked about, earlier in our conversation, coming here and having this conversation with you, I'm not comfortable doing this. This is not who I am. I don't share my story. I'm not, you know, trying to do that. But at the same time, for whatever reason, there was something inside of me that felt like, oh, this is something important that I should do. So, so yeah, I agree with you. I'm very, very aware of that very nuanced space where too much, too little.
Fine.
Yeah, the fine line. Yeah.
I was going to take us back, and sorry to have to kind of go through this in a bit more detail. There must have been a point in hospital. Fair enough. At any point when you were in hospital, first question I'll ask is, did you feel like this was the end? That you were, what they were saying, listen, you're going to die, you may die. We're dealing with no, a fine line between life and death now.
That's a really good question. I don't think that I ever thought I had such faith in my support network, and I had such faith in my doctors that I just felt like if I listened to their advice, I would be okay. You know what? You just reminded me. There was a moment. I was recovering. I hadn't gotten my amputations yet. I still had these floating infections running around my body. I'd wake up with high fevers. There was, I was still, tachycardic thing. And there was a moment where I remember having a conversation. I can't believe I haven't thought about this. You just may remember this. And I was talking with my brother, and all of a sudden I just felt everything fading really quickly. Like I felt like almost like you're falling. That's what it felt like. I was laying in the bed and I couldn't move at this point. Like I literally couldn't move. I couldn't move my head. I couldn't move anything. I was totally paralyzed. And I remember feeling like I was falling. And then the last thing I remember was all these bells were going off. The nurses started screaming and they said, get the crash cart or something like that. And I remember there was, and then I blacked out. That was it. And when I woke up, there was a nurse. standing over me with the paddles, like ready, like this. I knew what they were, the paddles like this, and not hitting me, but just standing there. And I was like, okay. And I guess in that moment, this was before my amputation, so it's still really sick, and I don't know exactly what happened, but in that moment, like everything crashed. My heart rate went out, my blood pressure went out, everything went down, and it was like so sudden because I was on kind of this upswing. Like I wasn't in a coma anymore. I wasn't, you know, clinically close to death, and then all of a sudden, bam. And I remember then the doctors, like within a couple of hours, were like, "Look, we've got to make a decision with these limbs. This is rotten, bacteria filled flesh. Like, you know, eventually your body's either going to self amputate or you're going to die. But either one of those scenarios is not, that's not how we do things. So, we've got to get this stuff off of you like now." That moment of that crash cart moment with the paddles and that whole thing, which I can't believe I hadn't remembered until you just brought this up, um, was a moment of mortality. And I remember thinking, well, I don't want to die. And that was ultimately what drove me to make the decision to amputate my limbs. I just said, I don't want to die. And if doing this gives me a better chance of life, of living, whatever that version of life was, because you can't contextualize what life's going to be like without limbs and without this and without that. You can't possibly imagine what that's like. There's no version. You couldn't watch a movie and see somebody in a wheelchair and be like, oh, okay, I get it. I know what life's like in a wheelchair. No big deal. So, without that knowledge through experience, there's no a priori knowledge there. You don't have that. It's all abstract. Yeah, it's just
Feel like
theoretical. But I do remember saying to myself, you know what, I want to live, and if I have to cut my limbs off to live, then I'm gonna do it, and I want to live.
this is probably a point of realization where psychologically, mentally, you've now, to a degree, for trying to put it into context, accepted the fact that this is way more serious than I could ever even imagine. And you're now at a point where probably in mental point of view, you're on hold for your epic. And that's interesting because your belief, your cry, your unrelenting belief, I would say, drove you, pushed you. But unfortunately, that moment that came was probably once caught up and the true reality and the gravity of the situation really. Um, so we're at a point now where from being unwell, you got with the plea to essentially the lack of spleen causing you to have an infection which is spread to the point where ultimately we're talking about life and death. You've had to make a decision, or to a degree, a decision that's been taken away from you to remove your limbs. I have to deal with subsequent consequences. Ha- What what's been the journey like? Because you've touched earlier on 9 months down the line. That was probably one of your lowest points where you got home, no support network, no routine, people not around you, true isolation. So the two questions I'm going to ask you on this point is number one, the journey from the hospital to getting back to that situation, which was harder, the physical or the psychological situation?
So, I got sick in February. I woke up sometime in March. I amputated my limbs in late April, and I left inpatient care in late December. And the the moment of being alone was so much harder than anything physical. And I would even attest that that's still the case today. Um, for anyone, when you have people around you you have a sense of purpose. And when you're alone, it's really hard. And, there's no better example of that than when they do studies on older people in nursing homes and who don't have family around them and who don't have a sense of purpose in life anymore. Even when I was in the hospital and I was really sick, people were coming to visit me and I was inspiring them. I had a sense of purpose. It had a relevance to my life. And the psychological impact of feeling irrelevant and useless is so incredibly heavy and detrimental to life itself that it's almost impossible to survive that. And I mean, it's why they say solitary confinement is torture, right? It's like we're social creatures, you know, we're the millions of ants in our little colony. It's like we can't exist without one another. And so, the recognition of that has been, really profound. And um, I'm aware of it in a very intimate way.
I can see it's been a clear challenge, but where you're at now, let's talk about arguably we've talked about the highs, we've talked about probably your lowest. Now, how did you get yourself up from that point? Essentially on your own, isolated, being killed with the reality of the situation, your future, everything necessary to where you're at now, because clearly, the person I've seen today is an inspiration, self to millions. And I want to know, what was it that helped you along this way? What was it that helped you get from the top down to the bottom to then drag yourself up?
The short answer and the truth is I didn't. A very close friend of mine invited me up to, he's got a farmland up in Northwest Wisconsin. And, COVID was bearing down on the city of Chicago. They were pulling freezer trucks up to the hospital. The world was coming to an end. And my doctors, who I've mentioned I'm very close with, they just said, "Hey, man, if you can get out of town, you might want to get out of town. Like, you're immunocompromised. You're not the guy that survives this. You get COVID, you're done." And I was like, okay. I had pulmonary embolisms. I'm not, uh, so, so I said, okay. And so I was talking to a friend of mine who has this farm up in Northwest Wisconsin, and he had a house on his property that his grandmother lived in at the end of her life. And it was a handicapped accessible house, small little, ranch house. But it had a ramp and, it was, reasonably accessible. And I went to his place. I went to this farmhouse. And the day after I got there, he's sizing up. I'm in a power wheelchair. I've got no prosthetics at this point. I'm essentially helpless. I can't toilet myself. I can't do that. I can't feed myself. I can't do anything. I'm just, you know, a child. And if you've ever seen, there's this phase, if you have children or been around children at a young age, there's this phase with young children. If you've ever watched them try to get dressed and they're extremely frustrated and they're just throwing a tantrum because they can't figure out how to put the shirt on right or something like that. That was my life. Every second was my life because it was like, can't, I can't do this stuff. I don't want to live like this. This is crazy. Um, and he takes a look at my wheelchair. This guy named Dave Zawitowski. He's a cranberry farmer up in Northwest Wisconsin. Sizes it up, and he comes back a few hours later with this, piece of metal that he welded up in his, garage. As all good farmers are, they can fix anything and weld anything and do anything. And bolts it onto my wheelchair, and then pulls out, brings over all these rifles and puts a rifle on top of the stand, and he sets up these targets out in the field and opens up the sliding glass door and says, "Let's figure out how we can get you shooting." And, I think we're tying a string to my stump of an arm and he's holding it. But I was able to fire off a few rounds. And it was just this moment of like, okay, like, and who knows what I had? Couldn't, I was, essentially blind for 2.5 years as a result of what happened as well. So, but it was a very cathartic moment, um, and then
There's a sense of normality.
it was a sense of normality. The next day, he takes me out, carries me on his shoulder. Again, got no prosthetics. There's still 3 feet of snow on the ground. Puts me in his pickup truck. We drive out to a field, and there's a piece of equipment out there, an excavator. And he's like, "You want to run it?" And I was like, "Oh, Dave, I don't have any hands. How can I run it?" He's like, "Ah, we'll figure it out." This sense of optimism, this sense of like, "Ah, we'll figure it out." So he carries me up, puts me on his shoulder, puts me in the cab, duct tapes my stumps to these controls. He's like, "Don't worry about the foot pedals. You're not moving the tracks, but do me a favor, move this pile of dirt from here to there. The gas gauge doesn't work, so I don't know. It might run out of fuel. And if you got to take a leak, just pee on the floor, and I'll see you in a couple hours." And he drives off, takes off. And I'm sitting there, and I start moving this dirt from one pile to another. And in that moment, again, I was like, okay, like I can do something. Like I'm not useless. I'm not helpless. I have purpose. I have meaning. I can move a pile of dirt. And so when people ask me what part of your journey was meaningful, and, you know, I tell them, I'm like, look, it's gunpowder and diesel fuel. I mean, yeah. And, you know, but ultimately it was Dave, right? And, this go it alone idea, right? I have a really hard time describing to it because I haven't been able to forge that. Yes, I recognize that I have done pretty cool things in my life and that I've made decisions to do that stuff, but there is a very clear hub and spoke tracing system to support network, to other people, to decisions I made, to social groups and networks, et cetera, et cetera. And I would be remiss to sit here and tell you that I have some grand version of fortitude and I was able to muscle it up and figure it out on my own. And I tell myself I'm going to get better one day and pull myself up on my bootstraps. But I just, that hasn't been my experience in this journey. It has really been wholeheartedly. I've just been very blessed with an incredible support network and all the other ingredients that we talked about earlier in terms of positivity and optimism.
Someone would argue that as much as you can inspire others with your story, your biggest inspiration has probably been those people around you and the very basic human contact and human interactions that probably made the world a difference to you and to get you to where you are right now, which essentially is a very successful entrepreneur who's through the highest and the lowest of lows, has now found what I'm seeing. And this is the first time that we've interacted with somebody who is positive, optimistic, yet has been through things that we could even, some of us can't even be fair. Fair to see.
Fair to say. I really, you know, I I will say this to other people, and I do believe this. Whatever the pathway to get there is less important. But the end result is you have to believe that your best days are in front of you and not behind you. And no matter what your state and your condition is. And so I wrestle with that a bit because I had really great life experiences prior to having this. But there are more days where I wake up and think that the best is still in front of me and not behind me, even though I'll never tour my motorcycle again. But I've got a great group of friends who won't leave me behind. So when the time comes to go on a motorcycle tour, they bought one with a sidecar and threw me in the side.
Um, it's interesting you say that about the journey, and there's all these cliches. There's all these cliche phrases about, oh, it's not about a destination. It's about a journey. What you go basically for you. But I met someone the other day and they said, interestingly, as humans, we are always obsessed with an end goal. We're always obsessed with what we're going to achieve, what we're going to get. The reality is what is life. If life is not what's the end? One thing that's guaranteed for all of us is that we're all going to end up in the same place. Why is everyone so focused on trying to get that and trying to achieve that? And what I saw a lot of people that we meet that when we engage with them is you want to be able, not necessarily to enjoy, but be able to absorb and take something from every single challenge, every single aspect of the journey, rather than rushing to get to the end. No one wants to get to the end. Right, is it? Now, just before we finish, thank you first and foremost, but I've got this paper on the end. Before we met, I was speaking with Tamji. She was telling me we were going to have this conversation. I said, listen, I'm going to do 3 questions, and there are 3 things that I just want to ask you, which for me are 3 important messages, and their meanings, their words. So, what do you find is the real meaning of a challenge?
The meaning of a challenge for me is a sense of purpose and a sense of contributing to something greater than myself and helping other people along the way in the journey. That is what, at this point in my life, when I think about a challenge, that's what I think about. That's what I'm interested in.
So, what is adversity?
Adversity is like gravity. Accept it. It's there. Move towards it. There's no version. You can't wake up and float out of your bed. You're going to hit the ground. Adversity for the way I look at adversity is literally like gravity, because I think to myself, I drop something on the floor and I have to figure out a way to get up. And it's like, oh man, this gravity thing's really hanging me up here, But when you lose ability to do simple things, you're constantly reminded of it. And so, this idea that adversity is like weather and there's like sunny days and rainy days, I think it's just with us all the time. If you go through a day and you don't face any adversity, I, I, I would think you're probably just not aware of it. Like that it's around us all the time. As a doctor, you're acutely aware of it. There's little bacteria on your skin right now that'll kill you in a couple of minutes. Your body's in this constant battle, right? It's all working. So it's just part of life.
And finally, what's your definition of an obstacle? And in your life, what's been the hardest obstacle you've overcome?
My definition of an obstacle is sometimes you try to do the right thing. You really try to do the right thing and you get a completely opposite result. And trying to solve those puzzles in life is really hard. Those are obstacles because you can't get around them, you know? You think about that in terms of, your relationships or, something along those lines where, you know, you absolutely, if somebody waterboarded you to ask you if you did, the right thing for the right situation and this and that, and you get the complete opposite result out of the situation, it feels like you're hitting a wall. It truly feels like an obstacle. An obstacle is something that's really hard to get around, or maybe impossible even. There are obstacles that you can't climb over. And so, in my life, that's what right as I sit here now, those are the things that really trouble me the most because they're like unsolvable puzzles and they really are obstacles.
What has been your hardest?
My hardest obstacle has been my relationships with other people and not being able to achieve the outcomes that I set out to achieve in the relationship. That people, unlike machines or businesses or finances are very unpredictable. And that just when you think you know someone and you know how they're going to react to certain stimuli or whatever, they give you a very different result. And it's the most confusing, confounding thing that I've dealt with in my recent life. Physical obstacles and challenges are, I can go to the gym, I can get stronger, I can get better prosthetics. I couldn't see. I found a doctor to help me see. Took 3 years, but he did it. My knees hurt so bad, I couldn't go up or down steps. I went to physical therapy every single day and didn't give up. So, but I haven't had the same luck in my interpersonal relationships in that sense. Sometimes it feels like the harder you work at those things, the less efficacy you get. And I it's a great question, and I'm so happy you asked it because I don't think I really thought about that before. But it is, yeah, it's truly what keeps me up at night. It's what keeps me up at night.
It's the uncontrollable.
It's the uncontrollable.
It's the situation you can do 100 times and maybe get 100 responses.
Yeah.
And as we mentioned, how do you control?
Yeah. Yeah.
So Jay, I want to thank you so much for your time, for sharing your experiences. You are an incredible individual. I know this is the first time you met, and I hope it won't be the last. We'll always have a home here in Dubai whenever you come over. I look forward to us catching up with you.
It'd be great. I look forward to it also. And you've got a friend in Chicago.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. This was MindLift, your destination to unlocking your peak health performance. Backed by science and inspired by real-life stories. Brought to you by the Brady Performance Center, a DP World company. Filmed here at the vibrant city of Dubai.